We're going to discuss an alarming topic today, Zach. So alarming that every time I mention it, I'm going to do eek. It's the pandemic panic eek. And there's there've been a ton of articles. You know, can you guess about what is occurring during the pandemic, according to some people?
People are doing whatever it takes to get them through the pandemic. So people are worried about what everyone's habits are turning into. No one could possibly acknowledge or assume that people could alter their habits now, moving forward. People are worried about ongoing anxiety and depression and despair.
Well, the focus especially has been on alcohol.
Of course,
because there's been all these articles. Well, the local liquor store where I live on Cortellia Road is doing a booming business. They, even before the pandemic was over, they had an outdoor takeout window, sort of like McDonald's, except you can't drive up to it because it's on the sidewalk. We're living in Brooklyn after all.
Which is great, isn't it? Because I remember the early days in the pandemic, I was so I must have been like everyone else watching hoping that Donald Trump can put together coherent sentences. I'm not trying to get political, but I was just hoping he could say something that might ease my nerves a little bit when that all started happening. And boy, did I do it with a martini in my hand.
You're an exact example of pandemic panic. You're the topical. So let me ask you a question.
Okay.
Have you drunk more during the pandemic?
Yes.
Well, this one is for you, Mr. Pandemic Panic. There's a big article in the Times, but it's one of thousands. I mean, a ton of them. Here's how it begins. In 2020, researchers at the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism found that from 1999 through 2017, per capita consumption increased by 8%, and the number of alcohol-related deaths doubled, many caused by liver disease. This is how the article begins. Whereas the number of men who reported any drinking stayed mostly the same, the proportion of women who did so increased 10%, and the number of women who reported binge drinking or consuming roughly 4 or more drinks in about 2 hours increased by 23%. This begins an article about pandemic panic, but it says that they found from 1999 through 2017, per capita consumption increased by 8%.
Oh, I see.
That's before the pandemic. It's a funny way to introduce an article about pandemic panic by talking about something that's broader than the pandemic. The second thing is the number of men who reported any drinking stayed mostly the same in that period.
Mm-hmm.
And then it increased the number of women consuming roughly 4 more drinks in about 2 hours increased by 23%. Man, that sounds like a lot, but increasing by a quarter, it depends a lot on how many people were drinking 4 more drinks to start. We're going to get into that.
Right.
So you're aware of something else that happened between 1999 and 2017, I think.
And just insidious numbers of people died of drug-related fatalities.
So I'm just going to throw in a little reading. We're going to cover a lot of bases here. Life expectancy in the United States has fallen recently for 3 years in a row. A reversal not seen since this is pre-pandemic. This is or in 1918 or in any other wealthy nation in modern times. In the past 2 decades, deaths of despair from suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism have risen dramatically and now claim hundreds of thousands of American lives, and they're still rising. Ann Case and Angus Deaton explain the overwhelming surge in these deaths and shed light on the social and economic forces that are making life harder for the working class. Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, that's the name of the book they published in 2020, paints a troubling portrait of the American dream in decline. For the white working class, today's America has become a land of broken families and few prospects. As the college-educated become healthier and wealthier healthier. Adults without a degree are literally dying from pain and despair. So that's not an alcohol. That's not a pandemic panic for alcohol. The whole deaths of despair, is it? What's it? It's a
No, I mean, they say it in their coinage as deaths of despair.
People like you are not their concern. And actually, alcohol is not their concern exactly because they throw it in with drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, have you become an alcoholic? You've been drinking more. Have you deteriorated as a result of your drinking?
I don't think so.
All right.
Actually, strangely,
you and I are.
No one will believe this, but I think I've become more productive than I have been in past years. And I wouldn't say that's a function of drinking, but it's certainly drinking.
As the college educated became healthier and wealthier, adults without a degree are literally dying from pain and despair.
Mm.
So you don't fit into the pandemic panic, but you do fit into the deaths of despair and future of capitalism because you do have a college degree.
Yep.
So you're in the privileged part of things. So you personally and the deaths of despair going in 100% or whatever, 160 degree, whatever, different direction from the alcohol freakout one. And I mean, what would you attribute to your greater, why would you say you're more productive even during the pandemic?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. I mean, related to having a college degree, the job market that I'm in didn't really decline. I mean, we needed educators and people were able to work remotely, and so I could do that. But I did worry about that, and I think I'm fairly resilient. I'm the kind of guy who I can soak up jobs different places. So I had my rather than sort of lose it, I knew that I had resources, and I knew that I had some skills, and I know that I have networking, and I'm pretty creative. So I got odd jobs and tried to figure out different things that I could do and spread out a little bit and diversify. And all of those things seem to kind of pan out. So
you plug directly into the deaths of despair, and for God bless her, God damn us,
mm-hmm.
We're in a privileged elite who can find work, and we're not going to be thrown out in the street for the most part during a pandemic.
Right.
We're not working at basic jobs, servers and construction and jobs where they can be, they sort of can't take away all school personnel because they have kids that have to do something.
Right.
So you see how the whole pandemic panic points us in a misdirection, at least if, that's a despair in the future of capitalism. They're talking about fundamental underlying economic and social trends.
Right.
They're not talking about, people are locked in their houses and so they're more inclined to drink alcohol. I'm going to jump ahead to read some of the, letters or the comments that were written about this article. My father was a raging alcoholic who died at 53. My uncle was a raging alcoholic who died in a puddle of himself alone at the age of 52. A puddle of himself, wow. My brother-in-law was a raging alcoholic who died in a puddle of himself at his bed at 49. My aunt died at 65 alone and pretty much a very sad and abused woman. The people in my family are not a good example of how to live your life to their children. It's a pregnant comment. Alcohol kills you in the prime of your life, and it is very, very sad. We need to solve this.
Mm.
She's not writing about pandemic panic. She's got something else on her mind.
Yeah, you walked me through, and you just now in real time, you walked me through the idea of class differentiation, but to me, I read that, and that's immediately what jumps out at me. I immediately think, isn't that interesting how people who have less are not able to cope as well as people who have all the resources at their disposal. People can't get around that, can they? People can't It's there. The information's there. It's not like maybe it's framed in a way to make people panic about the pandemic, like you. But it's almost like we don't want to address that part.
Well, we don't know much about this woman's economic background, although it doesn't sound like things are going well economically, I wouldn't guess.
Right.
But she's also not talking about the pandemic. She's talking about her family and alcohol.
Yeah, understand.
All of those things happened before the pandemic. And there is this pregnant thing. People in my family are not a good example of how to live your life to your children.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to suggest big, larger questions. Alcohol kills you in the prime of your life, and it is very, very sad. We need to solve this. What's she want to solve? Does she sound like a good candidate for banning alcohol altogether, you think?
Yeah, that's what she would like to do. That's my point. The article and she are outlining all the information you might need to reasonably come to a conclusion about what's going on here. But she lands on, we need to get rid of alcohol.
She came into this, let's just say she didn't necessarily read the article.
Right.
She said she saw something about alcohol being bad and she jumped in with both feet because alcohol is a bad thing for her in her life. We need to solve this. How would she solve her family's problem?
But I think she could have read it. She might not have, but let's say she did. I think a lot of people are reading articles like these and seeing that there are two problems, and the differential problem is alcohol for whatever reason. It's like that all of these multifactorial reasons why people are having a really tough time in life. And then also people seem to be drinking more, and that we see, that's a lot of problems. Plus alcohol is just making it all worse. We need to get rid of alcohol. That's the easy statement.
Another way, the way I think about it as why we talk about the fact that there's a plethora of theories of addiction. And that's sort of because this woman's an example of something, which is everybody comes in with their own theory of alcoholism and addiction based on them.
Yeah.
Since everybody has had some experience with alcohol, they say, screw all these theories.
Yeah.
Look, it ruined my family. Alcohol's bad. We need to solve this. Okay, here's another. I just picked these at random. There were thousands. Thank goodness I quit drinking in 2009. If I carried on during COVID like I did back then, again, it's a little bit of a non sequitur. The article is about pandemic panic drinking. Hey! But he said he had problems with alcohol. He quit in 2009. Thank God. Because if he would have been drinking during pandemic, who knows what would happen. Alcohol, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, this is complex. As the daughter of alcoholics, I scarcely drank, especially during my daughter's childhood. I wanted to be utterly available for her. Now, okay, being a mother and being connected, you could have mentioned that along with your work. You have a family and a young daughter. Semi-retired, the occasional glass of wine turned into 2 or 3 at night, and I began to see a future where drinking started at 5 p.m., just like my parents. Zach, should I confess now? I do most of my drinking before 6 a.m. It's beneficial for me to drink alcohol, so I pour bourbon in my coffee, and I get up very early.
How early would you say you get up?
Oh, I get up at 4, and sometimes I walk and go back to bed. I was very much affected when I read that primitive people who lived by fire, they would hang out around the fire, chatting and everything like that, and then go to sleep, and then they'd sort of wake up in the middle of the night. What we consider insomnia sort of is, when the sun descends, people said, oh, well, they nod off, and then they tend not to sleep 10 or 12 hours. They got to hunt and do whatever the hell they have to do. So I said, oh, I'm like primitive man. I'll just follow that trend. You remember we talked about my mother said, well, they hadn't invented dyslexia. My mother also didn't believe in insomnia. My mother said, well, if you're laying in bed and not doing something, that counts as sleep. So my mother didn't believe there was such a thing as insomnia. If you just laid there, you had to add that onto your sleep total, and you couldn't complain the next morning and say, oh, I didn't get any sleep. All right, so this woman didn't drink much because her parents were alcoholics. She didn't drink much. I scarcely drank. Semi-retired, the occasional glass of wine turned to 2 or 3 a night, and I began to see a future where drinking started at 5 p.m., just like my parents. I stopped for 4 years, but never stopped missing it. Now I drink a glass of wine socially or after a particularly rough day, 5 or 6 glasses a month. Huh. What would we call that?
Barely drinking.
Barely drinking. I wouldn't even call it moderate drinking.
Yeah.
It's certainly controlled drinking.
It's almost like you accidentally drank one time.
I know it's better not to drink at all. But I long ago quit smoking, quit eating sugar and meat, and run 25 miles a week. So I guess she's figuring, well, look how healthy I am. I don't smoke. I don't eat sugar and meat, and I run 25 miles a week. So if I do something unhealthy like drink, well, okay.
It's a lot of effort to convince whoever that it's okay that she drinks once in a while.
Well, she's fighting with, well, she agrees with the first woman that alcohol is bad, but she wants to drink. I will allow myself the pleasure of a fine wine. Now I know it's better not to drink at all. I will allow myself the pleasure of fine wine. That woman's kind of at war with herself, isn't it? You're buying most alcoholics don't buy a nice wine. You know what I mean? The pleasure of a fine wine.
Yeah.
And stop the endless and exhausting internal debate.
So she really is at war with herself.
What's that?
She really is at war with herself.
Yes. A little wine is soothing. That sounds good again, doesn't it?
Sounds very reasonable.
And this is in the same sentence, and if I am weaker for having some of, then so be it. I don't know. We don't have time to. How would you go into therapy if you had a person whose drinking was extremely moderate and controlled, and they enjoyed it, and yet they worried about it? How do you deal with a person like that? In all of these cases, we're talking about people's belief systems. There are only 2 drinking problems. This is philosophical. Drinking when you don't want to, and not drinking when you want to. An increase of my drinking earlier in pandemic forced me to align what I do with what I want and with what's good for me, and to ignore the external and internal voices that tell me to do otherwise. He's almost like responding to these other 2 people. He's saying, well, get in touch with what you want to do and what's good for you. Now I enjoy drinking whenever I want to, and I don't want much. He's sort of saying, well, once you relax, you're going to remove that high level of whatever it is that's driving some people to drink.
The one woman was feeling utter guilt. She had to explain away in detail why it could be okay that she drinks wine sometimes, and almost apologizing for it. I'm so sorry. I know this is wrong, but I'm sorry. I do drink wine, and it's very nice. And this guy said, yeah, it's nice. I just drink whenever I want to, and I kind of let loose. And for me, letting loose is I keep it moderate.
So he's got a theory of alcoholism that when you remove the guilt, you're going to drink less. That's what he says. Simple but not easy, and definitely not for everyone. Alcohol is, after all, an addictive carcinogen. Oh shit! Now we're into cars, and the same as the ethanol that's mixed with gasoline. So he's down into the alcohol is poison department.
Yeah. He's really reductionist.
Like so many others, I began to succumb to pandemic-related drinking last year to escape boredom. My husband and I started watching, you might think I'm writing all of these, but I don't know all these details. I couldn't make these up if I wanted to. My husband and I started watching Mad Men in March, and in the spirit of that show, we started drinking old fashions right along with Don Draper and his alcoholic friends. Next thing I knew, I was drinking 2, sometimes 3 a night. Those drinks were always followed by some kind of caloric snack or dessert, which is interesting. I mean, somebody could write a big bunch of articles about people gaining weight and eating chocolate.
Yeah.
On June the 1st of last week, I decided I was done letting alcohol rob me of my life. I stopped weekday drinking and limited my weekends to maybe 4 drinks. So we're sort of back to controlled drinking again. She started drinking regularly. She gained weight. She cut back to drinking. The effects were unmistakable and almost immediate. I lost 10 pounds. I woke up every day with a clear head and the ability to focus. And I had a lot more energy to work out in general, take better care of myself. My attitude towards alcohol shifted from a treat I thought I deserved to a potential danger of which I needed to be wary. I'm trying moderation for now since I generally don't do well with total abstinence of anything. So far, it seems to be working, and I did it without help. Wow, a lot going on there. She's sort of like the guy before, except the guy before says, when I eliminated guilt, then I didn't want to drink so much. She says, well, I used to drink for pleasure, but now that I'm wary, I drink more moderately. And she mentions both of them. Well, the last 3 people all said they controlled their drinking one way or another. It seems to be working, and I did it without help. So they have different varieties of mindfulness. Some varieties of mindfulness are, well, let's just do what's pleasurable for me. And some varieties of mindfulness focus on the, let's do what's good for me.
Notice that you can sort of tell, it's like a folk psychological way. Any lay person could just hear you reading these and see that one might seem a little contradictory, or one statement might seem, well, that's really common sense. It sounds right. And any of the ones that are obviously commonsensical, nobody is living their life around alcohol. And they're responding to this and talking about their alcohol intake. But it sounds like anyone who's living reasonably is not completely cutting alcohol out of their lives. And they're just don't let alcohol become the focus. They're talking about much bigger and better things in life.
These are a bunch of people who are dealing with an addictive drug. And they're saying, well, you know, I thought about it. I'm fitting it into my life. What brings me pleasure, what I want to do, and what's healthy. I don't know. That's sort of called, well, we call it the life process program of addiction. If you just like figure out what your life is about, you'll fit your addictive drugs or alcohol into that process. Or addictive habits. That woman was talking about sugar, and well, one was gaining weight and one was running 25 miles. People are different. You ever get the feeling? Here's another one. Honestly, I didn't just pick these ones. Well, I mean, there's the one woman who never drinks, so I did pick that out. My mother died from alcoholism. I learned my lesson when at about age 20, I shared a bottle of vodka with my neighbor next door, an old lady with the appropriate name, June Potts. I slept soundly, and in the morning I felt great, but my father said I had been sick that night. That was 1970. Good booze was cheap then, $35 for Latosh at Central Liquor, Washington, D.C. This woman's giving sort of a shopper's guide. I generally drank responsibly, although I did wonder one morning how the left front tire of my car wound up on the sidewalk. A trip to Belgium cured me of beer for many years. Follow this logic, Zach. The Chimay over here is not what it is over there, and nothing else comes close for me. So when she went to Belgium, the beer was so damn good. When she came back, she couldn't stand the American. But nowadays, you can probably get whatever that Chimay is here. Then adopted a daughter and no more money for alcohol. Honestly, we didn't bribe all these people to talk about the life process program for addiction. Well, I was single, then I didn't like the beer here so much, then I adopted a daughter. I mean, obviously, everybody's mentioned families. And no more money for alcohol. COVID-19 did not improve my balance sheet, but I'm still hoping somebody will bring me a little bottle of sin from the UK, chartreuse vegetal elixir, which is illegal for a wholesale import here in the US. I can understand people drinking more in pandemic. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, as they say. Again, everything in their lives contributes to your being addicted or not addicted. She's still longing for her single days when she really used to have some good alcohol. She has a daughter. She's waiting for somebody to bring some good, some better booze than she's used to. And then she throws it all back into kind of the religious framework. What was your reaction to it, though?
What yours is? I mean, you're reading anecdote after anecdote where people are kind of not talking about their drinking.
Right. They're talking about their lives.
And people who are privileged enough not to talk about their drinking when it comes to talking about what the problem is with their drinking are usually the people who don't have problems with it.
Exactly. Well put. This is the New York Times. The people who are dying deaths of despair are generally not reading the New York Times. Oh, I wonder how many people are drinking during the pandemic.
Right.
And writing elaborate comments into the New York Times.
That's true. If you're in such despair, how would you have time for something like that?
I mean, this is the privilege. All right. I've been saying we didn't make any of these up. This one, I swear to God, I didn't write this. I swear.
Why does it say Stanton Peel under the letterhead?
Yes, the tyrannical puritanical. The Puritans drank. So that's wrong. Temperance didn't drink, but that's not the Puritans. None of the pleasure, all of the pain. Every second, a slog of undiluted, unaltered consciousness. We must preserve health, and by health, we mean not experience pleasure at all costs, so that when we're old and or dying, we can be as aware as possible of our pain and suffering. Well, this guy's a little more negative than me, I think, a little more. Just ignore the reality that humans have spent millennia learning ever more about how to make beautiful, delicious, fermented, and distilled beverages. That sounds like me.
We get the point, yeah.
This art form, these artisanal practices must be destroyed. Just ignore that all human cultures have a space in the tradition for tweaking consciousness to inspire, and typically frame such as either both pleasurable and enlightening. I mean, this guy's a philosopher. I really hate to see this wave of carry nationism emerging. It typically ends up with poor, nonviolent people in prison for the audacity of engaging in relaxation, which sounds like something that might come out of the Drug Policy Alliance. I sent you a letter separately. They're trying. Poor people get involved with family supervision more.
Yeah.
And DPA is finally pushing. Where does that come from? Because they're always drug and alcohol testing them. And if you get any, government subsidies, they test you more. So obviously somebody would say, oh, what about all these people who've got these prescriptions up and down their wazoos? They're not getting tested. And if they are tested, they've got a prescription. And then poor people are tested. And then they, next thing you know, they're supervising your family.
So the same idea that people who are generally privileged love the disease model of addiction because I won't play mind reader. I don't like to do that. But you can see just from letters that we get and statements that people make and hate mail that you receive that the idea that people are diseased, that's so nice. That's so easy. And, we can treat it away no matter if it doesn't work. We just know if we pour more money and effort into the disease model, great. Meanwhile, that same mindset, it hurts the people who need most help, most reasonable help.
Right. How are all these poor people having so many? It always ends up, if you make up a disease, that more poor people are going to get it,
But more poor people aren't being treated for a disease.
Yeah.
More poor people are, even if that's wrong, more poor people are being treated
punished
punitively. Yeah.
Because now they justify testing them. I was actually a public defender, in family court, a family public defender. And what happens is they test you and then you have alcohol and then they make you go to AA. I mean, it's a whole shebang. And then you never get out from under it. It's a nightmare. It sounds like something out of the Middle Ages. And it's supervised in modern America. You wanted to talk about coercion. Let's be honest about what this is really about. The behavioral health types who went off and did their own thing 30 years ago because not every mental health professional wants to live like a nun. I don't quite get where he's going with that one. Can smell all those public health dollars circulating around the stimulus package, and dang it, they want theirs.
Live like a nun, like celibate abstinent, I think he's what he's saying.
So they're living, this would ring a bell with a lot of people. People in the privileged classes who get these degrees in psychology are testing poor people and throwing them in jail and putting them in treatment, coercing them in treatment because they need them. That's a crisis shall be created out of Netflix and chill. Can we not just be left alone?
Can you imagine, well, now we all can. Can you imagine being in a situation where all of your resources are uncertain? Things seem to be crumbling a little bit. The future seems a little uncertain. You're worried for your health and kind of living day by day to see what might happen. And then turning to something that gives you some sort of relief for that. Can you imagine it? And now we all have experienced it. And we can't see the parallel that you're trying to draw here, that there are people who that's their lives. And why wouldn't you turn to something to alleviate your suffering if you didn't have an attractive alternative to it?
If we would throw out a radical idea now, which is throughout history, people have taken psychoactive substances, including alcohol, number one, but a ton of stuff, and they fit it into their lives as best they can. And now we've invented a whole new treatment modicum where that's superimposed on everything and everybody's behavior. And the question is, are we better for it now? Has life really improved? AA was created in 1935. The disease theory became popular in the second half of the last century. We have all kinds. Are people really better off? Are people then being left to their own devices? That's a theme that keeps coming out through all of this. Everybody here came to their own conclusion about their life, including, the one woman up front, she decided to abstain because her whole family was really pulverized by alcohol. But everybody else has sort of navigated their own path in life around alcohol and drugs.
You're getting dangerously close to saying every uniform reaction to people addicted to alcohol or other drugs has never worked and maybe made things worse. But at the same time, if only you could scale letting people come to their own conclusions, or maybe helping them come to their own conclusions, that could work.
That was pretty well put, Zach. That's what we're trying to do with the Life Process program.
It sounds too stupid to be real. That's the problem, I guess.
It's too commonsensical to be like, you charge money for that? You help people figure out like what's the best thing in their own lives and then say, why don't you do that? All right, I'm going to switch to research now, just because I like to screw with people's minds. This came from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. That's the organization of cardiologists in America. Men and women who engage in light to moderate alcohol consumption have a decreased risk of mortality from all causes and cardiovascular disease, according to a study published August 14, 2017. The chief editor is named Bo XI. I have a secret prejudice. Whenever you get somebody who's not American who does this research, I think, oh, for God's sake, it might actually be objective. You know what I mean?
I have that bias.
They bring some guy in and say, why don't you look at the data? Bo Xi, MD, et al. Looked at the relationship between all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality risk and current alcohol consumption patterns. Now, hold your seat now, Zach. The researchers used data from 333,247 participants obtained through the National Health Interview Surveys from 1997 to 2009. Remember, that's the same period where people are starting to drink more and die. Alcohol consumption patterns are divided into 6 categories: lifetime abstainers, lifetime infrequent drinkers, former drinkers, current light drinkers, moderate drinkers, more than 3 drinks per week to less than 14 drinks per week for men, or less than 7 drinks per week for women, or heavy drinkers. Throughout the length of the study, 34,754 participants died from all causes. This is a national, you can't do this research to get your PhD. This is the United States government's tracking everybody's health. Of these, 8,947 deaths were cardiovascular disease, and 8,427 were cancer specific. So heart disease and cancer are vying for what's going to kill you. The results of the study showed that men who are heavy drinkers have a 25% increased risk of mortality due to all causes. However, the results were not significant in women. That's already so radical. I mean, they looked at 100,000 women and drinking differences of heavy drinking women. Of course, heavy drinking women is more than 7 drinks a week. So I would just say, who made that one up? Now here, I'm just gonna, if you remember anything, men and women who engage in moderate drinking had a 13% and a 25% decreased risk of all-cause mortality, and a 21 and 34% decreased risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, respectively. There were similar findings for light drinking for both men and women. So let's review. American Journal of Cardiology, foreign researchers, 1/3 participants followed for a decade. Light and moderate drinkers had a 13 to 25% risk of reduced risk of all-cause mortality and a 21, 34% decreased risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. Light to moderate drinking may have protective factors for either all-cause or cardiovascular disease mortality, write the authors. To decrease all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality risk, the researchers emphasize that a balance needs to be considered when looking at how individual patient recommendations, patient recommendations. However, reducing high alcohol consumption is necessary. So that's called a brief intervention, where you say, you know, maybe you're drinking, how much are you drinking? That sounds like a lot. Could you consider drinking less when you come in 6 months? Let's talk about it. If you want to call that therapy, okay, but it's a way of enhancing mindfulness because basically the odds are in your favor.
Right.
Whew.
And that's not saying don't drink. That's a football field apart from saying don't drink.
Okay, here's my last little input. Remember that we started meeting about percentages increasing radically. Here's the headline. Alcohol consumption rises sharply during pandemic shutdown. Heavy drinking by women rises 41%. Changes in adult alcohol use and consequences during the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. This appeared in the Open JAMA network. Research was researched by the RAND Corporation. And they looked at September of 1919 to September of 2020. Frequency of alcohol consumption increased overall 0.74 days over the previous 30 days, representing an increase of 14% over the baseline of 5.5 days in 2019. Did you get those numbers?
You
so they drank.
Anytime it's boiled down to a percentage, and it's boiled down to a percentage a few different times for a few different metrics, it doesn't make you think that their streets are burning and people have funnels in their hand and their mouths are open. Just
right. Well, 14% is a big number.
Right.
But if it is a baseline of 5.48 G's drinking in 2019. So, Lord forgive me, my reaction is people were only drinking 5.5 days on average in 2019. What the hell's the matter with them? They weren't drinking enough.
Right.
So an increase for women of 0.78 days, still 1 day, it's less than, representing an increase of 17% over the 2019 baseline of 4.58 days. Hey, it's an increase of 17%. But they're still not drinking one more. During the pandemic, they're not drinking even one whole more day. I don't mean drinking all day. I mean, they're only drinking 5.5 days out of 30 versus 4.5 days out of 30. Now, here's the scary data. For women, there was also a significant increase of 0.18 days. That's 1/5 of a day per 30 days of heavy drinking from a 2019 baseline of 0.44 days. So on average, back to just drinking it all, alcohol was consumed 1 day more per month by 3 of 4 adults. During the pandemic, 3 out of 4 adults drank on one more day out of the 30 prior days than before the pandemic. It's a little hard to say eek about that, isn't it? For women, there was a significant increase of 0.18 days, that's less than 1/5 of a day, of heavy drinking. Heavy drinking is 4 more drinks at one time, which represents an increase of 41% over baseline. 41% more heavy drinking by women.
The bar's pretty low, don't you think?
This equates to an increase of 1 day of drinking 4 more drinks for 1 out of 5 women.
That means several people interviewed or surveyed, and a few of them had to say, I'm drinking 1 more day a week. And you factor that into a percentage. Yeah.
And some of them, they're maybe at home more. And maybe late at night, maybe they've had a rough day. Maybe the kids have been running around screaming. And they drink a half a bottle of wine.
Mm-hmm.
They don't deal with marijuana here, you know. And maybe when they're drinking, if they just drink the wine and smoke some marijuana, they eat a giant slice of pound cake. So, of course, I think going back to our earlier discussion, what you and I would say, well, that's not really what's causing people to die deaths of despair. I mean, who is it that's doing this? 4 or more, 1 out of 5 women who are drinking 4 more drinks 1 day more a month. Who are they? Are they people with jobs? Are they working really hard? Do they have a family? That can be stressful. I'm not going to put that down. I mean, I had 3 kids. I mean, you know.
Are you asking, are the people who are drinking slightly more people who could tolerate drinking slightly more for a short period?
Well, we're going to go back to the beginning of this. You're drinking somewhat more, but you're feeling it's fit in within a productive life. You've got a wife and a child, and you got stuff to do. You've got a kind of a regular job, but you've got to look around more because there's less of that going on. And so we're not concerned in the life process program, or in how I would define harm reduction, which is like, well, what are the harms? We're not concerned with how much more you're drinking. You know, we're concerned with how your life's going.
Mm-hmm.
So they're asking, how much are you drinking 4 or more drinks, and 1 in 5 women's doing it 1 more day a month? My reaction is, who gives a shit? I mean, we want to know how well people are doing. And then, of course, that boils down to, well, what are their life situations?
Right.
Who are that? Where are they situated? I mean, there are people who are suffering. Everybody knows there are people who are suffering. But
So
that suffering is about, and the future of, it gets back to, that's the spirit of the future of capitalism. It's a question of capitalism and economics. It's not a question of a pandemic and alcohol. So we just going through, I mean, every newspaper, every news program has some kind of statistic and some kind of they run some kind of a rap about, oh, the pandemic's causing people to drink. You know, I'm writing my memoirs, I often mention. And, you know, I do a couple of, you know, overseas internet presentations. Pretty dull life. You know, what can I say? I do these podcasts with you. That's the highlight of my week for sure. And so, you know, I have 2 drinks probably before or with breakfast. So you could look at, I mean, there are people who would say, there have been people I've known who've said, you had 2 drinks before 6 a.m. in the morning? That's alcoholism. But, you know, then I know regular people who say, well, wait a second, don't you have to get drunk and like have problems before you get to be an alcoholic? It doesn't sort of matter when you drink the alcohol. That's not in
the idea. The idea is, well, you're not even able to get out of bed without drinking,
right.
That kind of a thing. But
I'm waking up to withdraw, and I do mix it with coffee because I think both coffee and alcohol prolong your life and reduce heart disease. But we're not putting that out there for anybody. But I am 75 and I'm still alive. You'll have to judge for yourself whether I'm still cognitively in tune and not suffering from dementia. We'll leave that for you to judge on your own. So this has been a review of Pandemic Panic about alcohol. We've related it to both our own lives. We've related it to clients we've worked with. We've related it to people, random people writing in comments in the New York Times about the article. And we've related it to the survey data. And, you know, let's just say we find that the pandemic panic is a little bit of an overreaction.
The way that we frame our problems is still centered around the people who are privileged enough to have the problems, to have those be the problems. And as we continue to see people who are less fortunate decline, it seems to be just the way that it goes. And you know, those same people who are taking the shortcuts and saying, well, I have problems and this is the reason there are problems, that those are a lot of those people are liberals, you know, the people who are compassionate. And I think that when it comes to thinking through a problem and really rendering human beings able to contend with the world, sometimes that compassion is a little bit, the efforts are misplaced a little bit.
Well, I'm going to say something, A, a little political, and B, against my own personal prejudices.
Against your own personal prejudice. Okay.
I'm impressed with what Joe Biden's done, because what Joe Biden's confronted what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people who are having problems in America with education and with money and jobs.
Right.
If we don't focus on them, they're going to, you know, whatever, disappear. They're not going to disappear. They're going to be self-destructive, which is back to depths of despair. Mm-hmm. So I want to pay attention to them. And that's a little bit of a hard lift, because, you know, an awful lot of progressives are fine. They're college educated.
Right.
So you sort of have to, I don't know, guilt them up, remind them, you know, we're all in this boat together. Things aren't going to go well if half the country are, you know, dying deaths of despair, and some people are, you know, just completely their lives are falling apart. That's not right, and it doesn't work. And he seems to really care about them. So what can I say? I'm a Joe Biden fan. Joe Biden claims he's never had a drink of alcohol in his life, like Donald Trump. So not having a drink in your life doesn't make you more or less compassionate. You and I actually did a podcast around the 4 granddaughters, mm-hmm. and we've talked about Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden's been interviewed on television, and the single thing he said that blows me away is Joe Biden calls Hunter. He has a daughter with his current wife and his 4 granddaughters every day. He's running the goddamn country. He's got to worry about China. He's got to worry about COVID. He's got to worry about the Senate and the Republicans and all these bills he's trying to pass. You know, what can you say about, I mean, who has, you wonder, how much does he sleep? I mean, I guess he doesn't go out and party much, you know, saving all that time, not drinking any alcohol. And he calls he has 2 surviving children and 4 granddaughters, and he calls every one of them every day. And he's trying to take care of the country, which is, what we're paying them to do. So, I'm going to doff my cap to a nutty non-drinker today. I got to say, I'm pretty impressed with a part of his whole operation there.
In other words, what you're used to having a reverse Pavlovian response to someone who's saying abstinence is the way, because they're the kind of people who are shouting through a megaphone about policy, and usually that policy is junk. It's like you're not looking at the problem. If you're saying to him, that's a goofy attitude you have for yourself, but hey, look, you seem to be doing some of the things that I've been talking about for 50 years. So what the hell?
All right, I've got to throw in one last little spoiler. DPA is down on Biden because they've extended whatever the hell they're doing with fentanyl, which I can never figure out. It's like doubly illegal. I mean, they do something really bad to you if you're caught with fentanyl. And Trump instituted that. And why did they do that? Because everybody's nuts. Forget, we've got alcohol panic. What about fentanyl panic? Eek! And that goes from Democrat to Republican to Democrat. And their DPA is fighting the good fight. They're saying, we don't need extra penalties for people who take fentanyl. How's that make sense?
Right.
First of all, why is it worse than whatever? B, they're taking it. Whatever. For some reason in their lives, they're taking it. And, how does making it a crime help anybody? It's just
right.
It's like the new version of the drug war. Oh, we're against the drug war. And this is where Carl Hart would come in. We're against the drug war for, psychedelics. You and I talked about that last time in marijuana, but we're for the drug war for opioids and people who take them.
Right. So, those drugs are ruining it for us anti-drug war people.
Right. All right. So it's a mixed bag, but there's life for you. All right. Au revoir. Happy Sunday.